Welcome. Today, I'd like to talk about the influence of Emma Hart Willard, and the way in which her creation of opportunities for women's education helped to launch the campaign for female suffrage, which came to fruition in 1920. On my initial slide here, you'll see a picture of the original Emma Willard campus in New York, and then Emma Willard, one of the many photographs of Emma Willard herself. Okay, so how does she get on this journey? First of all, we need to understand that she's a very influential woman. And so I have a quiz question for you. My quiz question is, what do Nancy Pelosi and Emma Hart Willard have in common? And what they have in common is they were both inducted into the Women's History Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, New York in 2013. But another thing that they have in common is the fact that without Emma Willard's emphasis and campaign for women's education, women like Nancy Pelosi, and probably Nancy Pelosi herself, would not have ended up becoming so prominent in our political structure today. So we need to understand, first of all, the world that Emma Willard lived in. First of all, she was born in a time when women were actually right at the beginning of the time when women were being shaped to address the needs and the assumptions of antebellum America. She was actually born in the 18th century, 1781, and in the immediate generation after the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution began to rapidly change the way in which Americans thought about the role of women and the role of men in their society. And that's where the cult of true womanhood begins to flower. Now, a true woman was a woman who embraced and also exemplified what I have here on the screen, the four female cardinal virtues. First, piety. Women were believed to be more religious and spiritual than men. This is a reversal from the colonial period. So it's kind of an interesting aspect of the way in antebellum America evolved. Secondly, women were considered to be more closer to God, more pure in heart and mind and body. And then finally, they were not leaders. They, in fact, were followers and submissive. And it was their role to be submissive to men. Men were the leaders, and they were the ones who were to set the tone, and as I've said here, dictate all of the actions and decisions in any particular household, or for that matter, the country. And lastly, domesticity, which is sort of a virtue, but it's also a kind of state of mind, is a way of understanding the growing divisions that developed in the early industrial America, where women occupied private space and men occupied public space. Now, one of the things that we need to understand about this is very much middle class set of notions. So for working people, especially laboring poor, slaves and servants, these divisions didn't make any sense. All women who were servants or slaves worked as hard as men, and their world was entirely different. But since the middle class was emerging as the kind of touchstone of the new American society. What the middle class believed about itself became very, very important for understanding these larger ideas about femininity and masculinity and so on. So under the ideal of domesticity, women's job was to maintain this household where men could come to be calmed from the rough world of public space where they were out there earning a living. And so it was a woman's role to, as I've said here, create a haven in a heartless world for both her husband and her children. Now, this sounds very, from our point of view in the 21st century, very limiting, and it was, but there was a mitigating factor to all of these ideas, which had also begun to emerge in the post-revolutionary period. And that is a new idea about the education of women. And this is probably best embodied in the notion of Republican motherhood. As this quote indicates, Emma Hart Willard was one of those, if not the first, one of the first women to really understand that education was important, that, as this quote says, the charms of beauty and youth were fleeting, and education was far more important. And in the notion that is encompassed by Republican motherhood, women were responsible for the education, early education especially, for their children, especially their sons, who would then be taking their place as the new enfranchised citizens of this new country. From Emma Hart Willard's point of view, education becomes foundationally very important. Now, some of these ideas actually were generated for her by her father, who sent her to a local school. He had to actually go to court and win a court case in order to force the local school to allow his daughters to attend because they were resistant to it. But from 1802 to 1803, Emma Willard attended the Berlin Academy in Berlin, Connecticut, where she lived. And that training allowed her to really blossom and flourish as both an intellectual person, but also to begin to think about the importance of women's education for all women, not just for her. And under the guise, if you will, of Republican motherhood, she began to think very deeply about what her role could be in advancing the cause of women's education. After she finished her own education at the Berlin Academy, she began to look for a job teaching. And there were actually 3 different positions that she considered or applied for. And one of them was at Williams College, or modern day Women's College, Williams Academy, where she actually accepted the position and went there thinking she was going to be a teacher, only to find out that she was really just kind of glorified teaching assistant. And that didn't satisfy her. The second position that she applied for was to go to Middlebury, Vermont, where she would replace a much beloved school mistress who had been operating a girls' school in Middlebury that had been established to educate the daughters of middle-class businessmen in Middlebury. And so she went to Middlebury, took up the position, and began to teach. But she found the job not as satisfying as she hoped, because there was a great deal of interference by the fathers of these young women that she was teaching, who were decidedly not as forward-thinking as she was about the education of their daughters. So she taught in Middlebury for a few years, and then in 1809, she married John Willard. Now, John Willard, who pictured here to the right of my slide, was a very important local businessman and investor, and was in fact a trustee of the Middlebury National Bank. And he was held personally responsible, along with the other trustees of the bank, when in 1814 there was a bank robbery. And many in the community thought it was an inside job. And as a result, they held the trustees personally responsible. And this ruined him financially. That process of holding him financially responsible catapulted Emma Willard into a new position of thinking about how she would help to support her family. She now had a young son, and their house, pictured here on my slide, was directly across the green from Middlebury College, a place that she had looked at with envy for the whole time that she was married to Willard, from 1809 to 1814. So in 1814, I always have this 30-second video that runs in my head that I can imagine John and Emma sitting at the morning coffee, having a discussion about how they're going to survive this economic setback, and Emma saying, well, I could open a school. I could train the daughters of Middlebury businessmen, and that would help us to survive. Now, I'm quite sure at this point that she had much more elaborate plans than that. But however it came about, John agreed, and they opened a school, mostly her, and the Middlebury Female Seminary was born. Now, the Middlebury Female Seminary was very different from the original school that Emma Willard had taught at. First of all, she immediately implemented a very male-oriented curriculum that looked very, very different from the typical curriculum of a girls' school. And in fact, if you see the ads for her school in the local newspaper, it's quite clear that she's teaching geography, history, Latin, Greek, natural history, and a variety of other subjects that Middlebury College was teaching. And so for one tuition fee, you could get access to all of that in the way of education. But if you wanted to learn the female arts of watercolor and the sort of genteel female arts, stitchery, and so on, you had to pay extra for that. So it's clear that Emma Willard did not really want to spend a lot of time teaching female arts. She really wanted to spend her time teaching the work of real education. So in 1819, things changed again for her. And one of the things that happened is that state of Vermont, the legislature of Vermont, decided to increase the value of higher education in the state. And it gave a considerable chunk of money to both what is now the University of Vermont and Middlebury College to promote higher education for men. And Emma Willard was, to say the least, incensed that she was overlooked because her school was clearly doing well and adding to the educational quality of Vermont. And so she actually petitioned the legislature to consider her school. And they more or less laughed her out of the building. In response to this, she, instead of simply walking away, she sat down and she wrote a very powerful piece that not only established the fact that women and females, girls, all had the same intellectual prowess as men, but that they would benefit from, as the whole country would benefit from, a as the title of her address says, a plan for improving female education. Educated women would move the country forward. And from her point of view, this was something that was really important that needed to be acted upon. So she published this piece, and it came to the attention of the New York State legislature, who then decided that they wanted to hear what Emma Willard had to say. And she actually went to New York and to Albany and addressed the New York legislature. Now, while she was in Albany, she was approached by a group of businessmen from Watervliet who invited her to come to their town and said, you know, we'll help you set up your school. And she promptly went home to Middlebury and began the process of moving her school to New York State. Now, she only spent a couple of years in Watervliet because the businessmen, however earnest they were not either able or willing to provide her with the kind of support that she needed to really get her school off the ground. And so the Troy businessmen, who were apparently in competition with the Watervliet businessmen, basically offered her a better deal. And so she picked up her school and moved it to Troy. And basically that was the foundation for the success of the Troy Female Academy that she then created. That move meant that she now would have a very powerful effect on both the quality and availability of education for women, as well as a very powerful effect eventually on the suffrage movement. So the Troy Female Seminary. Again, at the Troy Female Cemetery, this is effectively the first institution of higher learning for women. And she continued her policy of teaching traditionally male subjects at the Troy Female Seminary, including science. And she began to really flourish in her role as the school president, and she began to work very diligently on evolving new teaching methods for teaching geography, history, and at the same time as she is training her teachers to produce these educated students who then would go off and do education of their own, she was also publishing prolifically the her ideas and her the breadth of her knowledge, her teaching methods, and so on. And so she's having these multiple lines of influence, both on the notion of female higher education, as well as the effect that she's going to have on the suffrage movement. And on this slide, there's just a small selection of all of the things that she published, but you can see that she was publishing on publishing on history. She was geography, um, astronomy, and a variety of other parts of her educational curriculum, but also she began to write and publish poetry. So she was incredibly influential and incredibly powerful intellect uh, whose work began to circulate nationally and internationally as well. Now, the other way that she powerfully influenced both American culture and society, women's education, and women's suffrage is through um, many of her graduates who, although she herself was not a suffragette, and I think part of the reason for that is because it would have perhaps diminished her influence by scaring off potential students whose parents wouldn't send their children or their daughters rather to a radical school. I think she masked a lot of her political sentiment um, behind the intellectual work that she did. So her influence wasn't direct. She wasn't marching or writing suffragette um, pamphlets, but she was educating women who would. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the alumni that came from uh, the Troy Seminary and some of the influences they had. First and foremost, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was the both the creator of the women's rights movement, her and Lucretia Mott, which I'll talk more about in a second. And she was very much a product of the Troy Female Seminary. Clara Stranahan became a leader in female education. At one point, she was known as the best educated woman in America, and she became the founder of Barnard College. So very powerful educational influence, at least, and again, a direct legacy of Emma Willard School. Mary Arthur McElroy, who was Chester A. Arthur's sister, was also a graduate of the Troy Academy, and her probably her greatest influence, which I think is fascinating, is the fact that when she joined her brother at the White House in Washington, D.C., she became effectively the First Lady, and she established the role of the First Lady and many of the traditions that all First Ladies have followed since her. So she's very powerful. She's also a very well-educated person who influenced and again was very much in the evidence that proved that educated women were valuable. And then the last person that I wanted to mention here is another example of the way in which Emma Willard's influence became important in the lives of her students is Annie Hare Jack. Annie Jack, although she married a Canadian businessman and lived her adult life in Quebec, understood deeply the lessons learned, I think, from her Troy education. When she married her husband, who was a notable and very large fruit farmer, she required that he set aside an entire acre for her to engage in her horticultural interests, which were prodigious, and that any produce that came from it would be hers. The value of it would be hers. So not only did she establish herself as a horticulturalist, and she wrote extensively on um, the on all sorts of gardening, published in many magazines, and she published the first Canadian book on gardening. But she also claimed and held on to the value of her work, which I think is another one of the main values that Emma Willard promoted, even though perhaps not as publicly as we might expect in a later time. Now, going back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, here she is. She's sitting fourth to the left in the first row. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, first and foremost, was a member of the abolitionist movement, and her and Lucretia Mott, who's seating second to the left in this photograph in the first row, met in 1840 at a international abolitionist meeting, anti-suffrage meeting anti-slavery meeting in London. And while they were there, they met and were walking together in the garden outside of where the meeting was happening. And they were both really angry because they were told when they arrived that although they were welcome to attend the meetings, they had to sit behind a curtain and they couldn't speak. Both of them were outraged, and they decided that they really needed to have a women's rights movement or convention that would allow women to speak out. Now, it took 8 years to put it together, but in 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, Mott and Stanton, along with a number of other women, put together the first women's rights convention. Now, one of the things that happened as a result of this is they were very surprised at the number of people who came, men and women. Frederick Douglass was there, for instance. And they had something like over 300 people show up when they thought it would be a much smaller meeting. And it turned into a major, at the beginning of the movement itself, and a force for change. As a part of the meeting, they wrote a manifesto, if you will, and as they listed out the sentiments of the group who were there as part of the convention and what their demands were of American society generally, the last item, Stanton insisted, had to be women's right to vote. And that became, and it was, the launching of the women's suffrage movement and the campaign for the women's vote. And from that time forward, the trajectory of women's suffrage, although not perfect, moved along the lines that those first women, especially Stanton and Mott, hoped. Now, the campaign obviously had lots of bumps. The Civil War disrupted it for a while, but overall, the American women who supported the vote continued to lobby. Eventually, Alice Paul's amendment, which was written and proposed, began to circulate. And for many women, this became their hope. Some of it was derailed by racism, the fear that if women were given the right to vote, then that would give the right to Black women to vote. And in the post-Civil War period, there was a lot of fear that the African-American vote could change the trajectory of the country. But there were many prominent Black suffragettes as well. Ida B. Wells, for instance, was one. So, going back to the influence of Emma Willard for a second, I want to point out that one of the uh, more prominent suffragettes who who sacrificed herself to the suffrage movement was deeply influenced by Emma Willard, although in a different way than just or rather in a different way from the Troy Female Seminary. For one thing, Inez Mulholland was born more than a decade, actually more than 15 years after Emma Willard died. But she was influenced both by the expansion of female education that Emma Willard herself had started, but she was also educated at a school that had been directly influenced by Emma Willard. She mostly grew up in London, but decided she wanted to go to college in the United States. And she applied to Vassar College, but they would not accept her. And so from there, she went to the Berlin Academy. Now, the Berlin Academy, by the period that Inez Mulholland had also developed the Berlin School, the Willard Berlin School for Girls. And so it was there that she was prepped, if you will, for college, and then eventually moved from the Berlin establishment to Vassar College, where her education was completed. Now, Mulholland became a very important suffragette. She, you see here on the right, the picture of her on her horse. She was very influential in suffrage and in suffrage parade. She was very visible in this particular parade. There's all sorts of photographs of her on her white charger. And she was so prolific and so dedicated in her ability to promote the cause that she actually made herself deeply ill. And it was at a suffrage rally that she passed out and collapsed and eventually died. So despite her determination to see the amendment passed and to have the right to vote nationally, sadly, she did not survive the ability to do that. And that brings me finally to Phebe Byrne and the final influence that Emma Willard had on the campaign for suffrage. Now, Phebe, as she was known, was the mother of Henry T. Byrne, who was a legislator in Tennessee. And in 1919, the amendment was going through the process of the various states ratifying it. And all of the states who had been expected to ratify it had already done so. And so now the vote was down to Tennessee. And Tennessee, in fact, was expected to reject it. In fact, most of the southern states were expected to reject it. And so generally speaking, people who opposed suffrage were really quite confident that women's suffrage would actually not happen. In Tennessee, the legislature were coding how they were going to vote by the boutonnieres they were wearing in their lapels. Those people who were pro-suffrage were wearing yellow carnations, and those people who were opposing it were wearing red carnations. And so, of course, the people were watching carefully and counting the various carnation colors, and it looked as though there was going to be a close vote, but that it was going to go the way of rejection, except for the letter that Henry T. received from his mother, Phebe. The envelope here is from the original letter. The letter was 7 pages long, and essentially what Phebe told her son was that this was really important, that the amendment should pass, and that if he didn't vote for it, he was in trouble. And so he decided that the better part of valor was to do exactly what his mother told him to do. Now, Phebe was a college graduate and had, of course, benefited from all of the efforts that Emma Willard had engaged in the establishment of her school in Middlebury, and then in Troy, and then the expansion of higher education for women generally. And so I see Phebe as being a direct legatee, if you will, of Emma Willard's educational gift to women in the 20th century. And so when she wrote "Hurrah" and "Vote for Suffrage," this was something that developed out of her educational opportunities provided to her down through from the 19th into the 20th century from Emma Willard. So despite the fact that Henry T. was wearing a red carnation when he walked in to the Tennessee legislature the morning of the vote, and he voted for suffrage, the amendment passed. And because Tennessee then represented the last state needed to make the amendment an official part of the Constitution, women's suffrage became the law of the land. So I think that overall, the foundational movement of Republican motherhood, women's education, women's higher education, all contributed materially to the actual ability of the passage of the amendment and the right to vote for all American women. Thank you.